Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Today is a gift, not quite from me to you, but from Dell to me to you, from Dell to you. Dell is a viewer who has kindly taken the time. I don't know if it's kindly, he's probably got a lot of edification and joy out of doing this himself, liking the data as he does. But he's shared it with us, and there's a read only link to this so that you can look at this at your own leisure uh, at another time and place. So that's fantastic. Thank you, Dale. Brilliant. What is this data? Well, this is the general staff losses for the Russian different categories that I share with you every day at the beginning of my news video. All the usual caveats apply to that. Let's not have that conversation here, but let's assume that this data is kosher. What happens when we open the Excel spreadsheet? So you get this column here. And again, remember, you can use something like Google Sheets to look at this if you don't have any of the Microsoft Office package, and that's free online. So you can, when you open the document, you get this column with the totals for all of these different categories, personnel, and then the plus is what's been added today. So 800 added today, tanks 3,860, of which 12 were added today. APVs, armored personnel vehicles, so that's the IFVs, APCs, MRAPs, all that kind of stuff. 7,543, 20 added today, so on and so forth. And if you scroll to the left, you get all of the daily totals there, all of the columns that add up to the running total. Okay, so that's numbers. Numbers don't tell you stories, not very easy to understand, certainly visually. So good old Dell here has given us graphs of each of these categories. Now, each of these categories, or at least most of these categories, tell us a story. Let's try and work out if we can understand what's been going on here. A few things to mention beforehand. Dates. So this is from March last year, so February to March last year to right today, to right now. And hopefully he's going to keep updating this. He says he might not be able to do it every single day. Obviously, he's got a life and stuff, but so don't expect every day to be religiously updated at a certain time and whatnot. So a couple of dates are really worth knowing about. The Kherson counteroffensive started at the end of August and went through to the end of through to November. But actually, when you're talking about losses, most of the losses will be towards the end in terms of equipment. Personnel might be fairly consistent through that, but again, it's going to be October, November time that most of that will happen. Whereas if we look at the Kharkiv counteroffensive, that took place from September to October, much shorter time period, and that equipment would have been predominantly found in that time and afterwards. So that's September, but actually a lot of the equipment was found and logged after it happened, right? So, and in fact, only yesterday, a huge cache of arms was found in the Kharkiv area that represents, a significant haul, and that's basically from the Kharkiv counteroffensive that took place last year. So there will be a lag with both of these counteroffensives, I guess, in terms of some of the loss figures that we find. Okay, but is to let you know that this period here from September through to November, that period you might see an uptick in stats with certain categories here. And indeed, this is personnel, and you do see an uptick there. That is counteroffensive uptick, right? So again, this all tells you stories, right? Graphs. Let's just do a little bit of thinking about graphs, shall we? And move this out of the way because I want to use that space there. Good old mouse doesn't work. Thanks for that, computer. Okay, so right, let's do some gradients here. If we look at, so we're going to go to straight line. If we look at here, where you have a lot of losses in this period, you expect the blue line to be steeper. The blue line represents the overall running total. That will never go down in the same way that this yellow dotted line that represents the trends can go down. So that yellow line goes down here, because the dotted line, because actually we've moved from a period of losing a lot of equipment to a period of losing less equipment. So that's a downward trend. But overall, you're not going to see the blue line go down because you can't lose less than you had before. Every day you'll be either staying the same, so it'll be level, or you will lose some equipment, and that will add to that, and that will keep going up and up. Right, so the gradient here for this area where it was pretty, you might say pretty steep. I'm just struggling with hands today. So that is going to stay in that kind of, yeah, that's the gradient that will have. So you can see that it starts getting shallower from March onwards as we see fewer and fewer personnel lost, and that means that the blue line becomes shallower. So the steepness of the blue line will give you an indication as to what has been taking place with the losses. Now here we can see that there were fairly heavy losses in the February to March time, January, February to March. What was happening then? Well, we had Bakhmut being attacked by the Russians. They were getting closer and closer, and then into Bakhmut. Huge losses in those human waves. We saw losses elsewhere as well, Avdiivka and up and down the Svatva front line as well. But really, that's going to be a lot to do with Bakhmut. And then uh, since from April and May, when Bakhmut there was less and less presence of the Ukrainians in Bakhmut, the troop losses were dropping, but also everywhere else along the front line started quieting down. We see a drop in troop losses there, an uptick today. Today's one going up to 800 again. But that tells you, what was going on, and we had this high point here as well, which is representative of the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensives. Anyway, that's personnel. Let's move on to tanks. The tanks, you can see that there is a fairly consistent blue line, I guess, with some spikes here and there. So the spike is September to November. You get a lot of losses there. What happened? Counteroffensives happened. And then it kind of quietened down a bit, but you had days that were pretty bad. And again, February, March, I'd say that was activity around Avdiivka, not so much Bakhmut, where there wasn't too much equipment used in Bakhmut. And we've seen a recent uptick again in the last sort of week as the counteroffensive has become imminent. It's possibly starting to take place now. We have seen attacks on equipment as well there, but a lot of it was there were big numbers lost at the beginning of the war when you had large columns of Russian vehicles that were able to be taken out. You saw, you had approaches into Kiev that became just equipment graveyards, and the Russians just lost a vast number of tanks there. So that's your story of the tank losses over time. We'll see whether the counteroffensive that's just about to take place in the next month or so will see an uptick of tank losses. But part of the reason I think that tank losses have been not so great, we've got shallower lines more recently, is because the Russians have literally just run out of tanks. They're running low on tanks, which means that two things happen. You're either going to use tanks more cautiously. Well, both things. It's not either or. You're going to use tanks more cautiously. They don't want to lose their tanks, and they're not going to send them in willy-nilly. And also, they just don't have as many tanks, right? And that's why they're using them cautiously. So if they don't have as many tanks, then there aren't as many tanks to hit. So you'll see fewer tanks being hit as the war goes on, and destroyed as the war goes on, because they simply don't have them, and they have no way of being able to regenerate them or get given them in any significant numbers. Okay, let's move on to the armored personnel vehicles, APVs. We again fairly consistent, although it's steep here. Why was it steep there? Beginning of the war, columns of vehicles getting blown up, really costly battles as they were approaching Kyiv and other places. So they lost an awful lot of equipment here. And then again, September through to November, you've got the counteroffensives taking place there. And then you had, some fairly costly times. Avdiivka, of course, when you're talking about February, January, February, March, this time here, and this will be the same with tanks, where they lost quite a lot of tanks. Where did they lose a lot of tanks? Vuhledar. So this will represent what was taking place, where they lost like 100 or so vehicles around Vuhledar, and yeah, that the bad day for the bad time for the Russians then, and possibly might see that tick up. Well, you should almost certainly see it tick up as we go into the counter-offensive time period. Again, that's the story that graph tells us. Right, artillery. We have seen a really significant uptick in artillery recently. That trend line is quite steep there, and indeed the blue totals line becomes steeper here than it was here. There were bad times for the Russians during the counteroffensive period here as well in Kharkiv and Kherson, so that's when they lost quite a bit of artillery. But I think this here, I've talked about this being as a result of two things. One is that the Ukrainians are really trying hard to take out artillery, but you might say, well, does it mean they weren't trying hard before? It can't just be that they've suddenly decided to take out artillery. So I think they are deciding ahead of the counteroffensive to really make an extra special effort to hit artillery, but also because they have the capability, a greater capability to do so now. They have a greater technical capability to acquire targets because of the plethora of drones they are using and the amount of trained up drone operators they have that they wouldn't have had back here, right? So a year ago, they didn't have the army of drones raising, United 24 raising however many hundreds of $1 million, and they didn't have 10,000 drone operators trained up and ready to go. They didn't have first person view drones. They didn't have all these kind of different types of drones. That means that not only can they acquire targets, but these drones can blow up targets when you attach, RPG-7 warheads to first person view drones. So they have the ability and a greater ability and a greater desire to take out artillery over the last sort of month or two, and that's why you see this uptick there. But again, the counter-offensives of Kharkiv and Kherson have a lot to answer for in that middle peak. When it comes to MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems, I don't know that there's too much of a story you can tell from this, because they just don't have as many of these as, say, artillery pieces. And so the data, you can get kind of anomalous spikes here that might have just been a bad day for MLRS, so on and so forth. But you do have, you've got, days where over 8 of them are taken out. Did something significant happen there, or was it just a random day of being able to hit 8 MLRS? I don't know. But slightly more pieces of kit were lost around the counter-offensive period, and then quite a few at the beginning. And then I guess maybe now there's a bit more consistency coming online, and we'll see over the next month or so whether they are able to take out lots of MLRS. When it comes to aircraft, anti-aircraft air defenses. This is quite similar to artillery. I think the story you get from this is that yes, you are seeing the Ukrainians really trying to and being able to take out anti-aircraft defense systems that the Russians have. There was quite a few lost in just around the counter-offensive time period, and maybe as you're getting ready for a counter-offensive, you do your suppression of enemy air defense activities and your destruction of enemy air defense activities so that you are safer in committing to a counter-offensive. That is definitely what has taken place recently, so you've seen an uptick there as well. Okay, let's go on to aircraft, fixed-wing aircraft. This does tell you a story. So what happened at the beginning of the war? They lost an awful lot of fixed-wing aircraft. The heavy losses they took because they'd been quite risky. Why did they take heavy losses? They didn't do their suppression of enemy air defenses, destruction of enemy air defense operations before the war started, because they weren't expecting a war. Right? If you know you're going to do a war and you're going to be invading a country to take over that country, then you plan for a war, which means that you do months of seed activities to take out air defenses so that you can have air superiority. And once you get air superiority, you can do what you like with your ground forces because they have close air support, and it's just really difficult for the defending forces. but they didn't plan for a war. They planned for a special military operation and accidentally ended up in a war. So because they didn't do their seed operations and their DEAD operations, they lost a lot of fixed wing aircraft at the beginning of the war. And what this then meant is that they became more cautious with the way they used their VKS, the Russian Air Force. And that meant that suddenly there were, or not suddenly, it meant that there was just far fewer planes being lost. Uh, they did lose a number around, again, the counter-offensive times. You can see it was a lot more significant there, and that could be that the Russians had to kick into a defensive mode to try and defend their troops as they were getting hammered in the counter-offensive, so that they got close air support from their VKS, and that meant that they lost more planes as a result of the Ukrainian air defense systems. As we've gone on since then, you can't see really very many losses. And I just think that represents a cautious approach to the use of aircraft that we've seen from the VKS. As far as helicopters are concerned, broadly the same story. Losing a lot at the beginning, and then quite a lot in the counter-offensive time period as well. A little spike around December and January. I don't know what that might represent. Whether there were bases that were able to be hit, I don't know. Jankoi was hit, wasn't it, a few times? I don't know where that would sit around this chart. Drones. So these are more likely your Shahid drones and your larger sort of reconnaissance drones, not your basic little drones and first-person view drones that you're using on a battlefield to spot for artillery and whatnot. They get lost, by the dozens every single day. These are your larger pieces of kit. Now, we have seen a huge uptick recently in the last couple of months, and that's partly going to be because of how the Russians use their Shahid drones. As we can see here, maybe upticks around that area when they started getting them in. I think it was around then, wasn't it? And then a lot here, but also possibly this represents the increased capability that Ukrainians have in counter drone activity. So they've got a lot more electronic warfare pieces of kit in place. And this might look the same for the Russians as well, by the way, because they've been working hard on their electronic warfare systems. The Ukrainians lose a lot of drones, of course, as well. But I think recently that trend is reflective of a lot of kit that's been given to the Ukrainians because their Western allies know that this is a major thorn in the Ukrainian side, not only in terms of reconnaissance, but in terms of direct munitions like the Shahid. So that they know that this is an issue, and it's a case of giving them Gepards. So the Gepards are now in place, and lots of them with their radar systems, a really good air defense radar network that allows these larger drones to be more easily acquired as targets and more successfully shot down. So that now that over 90% of Shahids are shot down, whereas before when they were using Shahids a lot, that percentage was far lower. So that's your drones. Then you got cruise missiles. This again tells a pretty interesting story as far as I'm concerned. So you have these gaps between these. What happened is the Russians didn't really work out how they wanted to use cruise missiles. I think they used them fairly consistently at a fairly low level throughout until October last year. Then they kind of worked out that actually we should do saturation attacks where we send so many that we overwhelm their air defenses, and then this is where they started targeting the energy infrastructure ahead of winter so that Ukraine wouldn't be able to heat and power their civilian houses, and it would break the spirit of the Ukrainians, except it didn't. It's quite a mild winter, and they just didn't do it successfully enough, the Russians. But what we see here is this gap between these saturation attacks. Why is that? They just couldn't get enough of the missiles up in the air or shot at once, either from a delivery point of view, but more probably from a logistical supply point of view. They'll be getting these missiles from stocks they have existing all across Russia, getting out of warehouses in the Far East of Russia, getting them off ships that are out around the world, and you get them off the ships, and then you have to transport them, and then that takes an awful long time. and then they're manufacturing them as well, but with a much reduced manufacturing output. So you have to wait till you get them and then fire them all off. Wait till you get them, fire them all off. Wait till you get them, fire them all off, and then you get this huge gap in the April time, and this to me signifies that they've just properly run out the stocks, which is what we were saying for a long time, and then they were only able to restock with their production capacity. So you then have a period where they released no cruise missiles really for a month, and then you get them releasing a lot more consistently. So this tells me that they had to stock up for some time to allow them to do this, both using the end of their existing stocks and then whatever they could produce. No, we can't fire them for a month because we want to do loads of firing of them over a really, you know, a concerted effort over this time period of May to June. That's what you see, and I think they're only able to fire them at the rate they are producing them going forward. But I think that's a story that you learn, that we can derive from that picture. Okay, moving on to warships and boats doesn't really tell us much other than that the Russians lost a few at the beginning and then started using their navy really conservatively, and getting their boats right, keeping them well away from harpoons and other such anti-ship missiles that the Ukrainians have at their disposal. So you see the Black Sea Fleet after the Moskva going down, just staying well clear of Ukrainian missile capabilities. Um, Vehicles and fuel tanks, fairly consistent. You can see that blue line is pretty much the same gradient. Yes, heavy at the beginning. Yes, slightly heavier during the counteroffensives. And then since then, just being pretty consistent. I think we've seen an uptick there. I think here is where you start seeing first person view drones being used a lot more, and we get a slight move up. But again, the Russians are really, I'd imagine they're struggling for even these vehicles in the same way they're struggling to have enough tanks to be able to be targeted. We know that Russians are now having to use commercial vehicles to do a lot of their logistical supplies, and that might mean that it might be a deception, it might be a necessity, but it means that Ukrainians have to be careful with how they use these. They obviously don't want to be smacking into civilian lorries only to find out that it genuinely was a civilian lorry delivering stuff. So on and so forth. But anyway, fairly consistent across the war there. And then we have special equipment, and here we see a massive uptick over the last 3 or 4 months. And this will be because I don't think the Russians will have had much special equipment at the beginning of the war. Again, they weren't planning for a war. So we're going in with our Rosgvardia, we're going to turn over the government, put our people in place, and we're going to have the Rosgvardia, the riot police, to just clear things up afterwards over a 2 to 3 week period. Oh, what? Oh, well, they don't want us here. Oh, this is a war? Oh, bugger. And then they're like, okay, so they won't have brought in stuff like electronic warfare equipment. It just won't have been there. And it takes time for them to also develop stuff to be able to combat things that they won't have ever fought against before. This is new technology. A lot of this is new technology, so they'll be developing this and then bringing it online. So I don't think the Russians. I don't think they would have had as much of this equipment anyway. They would have built a lot over the period of the war, but also they wouldn't have had it in place in Ukraine for the Ukrainians to hit. So I think that this probably reflects that the Ukrainians are both aiming for it much more explicitly at the moment, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance equipment. But also you could argue demining and excavator equipment that could also be included in this, where the Russians have been doing so much building and defensive work, building of defensive works, and that includes minefields, that kind of equipment is going to be more abundant, so they're more able to, the Ukrainians have been more able to hit that. But also the ISR and electronic warfare jamming equipment, there'll just be a lot more of that, and the Ukrainians would really want to take that out because that is high value equipment, and they want to do that ahead of a counteroffensive. So that's why you've got a huge uptick of that kind of equipment being lost there. And then Dell has a page on Bakhmut. I haven't really looked at this, haven't had time to look at this, but you guys can pore over it, see if you can make any sense of what he's done here. I presume he's taken Bakhmut losses that he's worked out in terms of size, area, and troop losses that have been claimed of Bakhmut, and then extrapolated that across to other areas and said, well, if you've lost this many taking Bakhmut, you're going to lose this many taking these other big places, um, or bigger places. And then I'm not quite sure what this is in terms of data. And then he's added one. He's got the cruise missiles and UAVs added together because they're often used in unison, and so you can see that quite often there is a pattern that is reflected across both categories, and you can see that there. So that is hopefully you appreciate this as much as I do. This is really great stuff. And again, you can argue about the accuracy of the Ukrainian data, but this is a really good presentation of that data. Thank you so much to Dell for that and for allowing us all in this community to access his work. I really, really appreciate that. Anyway, please like, subscribe, and share. Do all the things that YouTube has asked you to do, like hit bells, blow whistles, and all that. Hugely appreciated. Take care, and I'll speak to you in a proper extra later. Toodle pips.